Hi, my name is Dr. Wendy Manell, and I'm a clinical psychologist. In my work with children, teens, and families, one of the most common things I see are deeply caring caregivers who are doing their best and still feeling stuck, exhausted, and unsure when big emotions take over. I see caregivers who want to help their child calm down, but aren't always sure how to do that in the moment, especially when emotions are high. So today's webinar, Soothing the Storm, Co-Regulation Tools for Caregivers, will focus on practical, evidence-based ways to calm with your child during moments of intense emotion, not by shutting feelings down, but by creating safety. Over time, these moments of co-regulation are what teach children how to manage their emotions more effectively themselves. So my hope is that you finish this webinar with practical tools that you can use right away. We'll set the stage by covering why co-regulation is important, and then we'll look at how, which includes staying grounded yourself, a 4-step emotion coaching routine you can practice, and setting boundaries with empathy. So I always like to begin conversations about emotion regulation by talking a little bit about the brain, because understanding what's happening in the brain helps us respond to our children with more compassion and less frustration. When kids have big emotional reactions, the behaviors we see are usually not intentional misbehavior. They're signs of a brain that's temporarily overwhelmed by stress. And the same is true for us. When we're under stress, we're not always our calmest or wisest selves either. Not because we don't know better, but because of what's happening in our brains in that moment. One of my favorite ways to explain this is using Dr. Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain. So I don't know if you could see me here, but very simply, my wrist and palm is the brain stem and is the part of the brain that involves involuntary functions like breathing and heartbeat. My thumb over here represents the limbic system. That's the emotional part of the brain, and this area is involved in our stress responses and survival instincts. As you move up here, our fingers represent our thinking part of the brain, so our ability to reason and reflect, and then that part of the brain folds over, and our fingernails represent this area of the brain, our prefrontal cortex. That's the part that's responsible for problem solving, impulse control, and planning. So if you look at it, it really is just like a hand model of our brain. And our brains develop from the bottom up. So the parts of the brain responsible for survival and emotion come online first, and the parts responsible for reasoning and self-control develop much later. In fact, the brain isn't fully developed until around age 25. That's really an important thing to hold in mind as caregivers because our kids aren't operating with fully developed brains yet. When emotions run high, they don't always have access to the parts of their brain that help them think things through or calm themselves down, even if they usually can. We all have a built-in alarm in our brain. That's called the stress response or fight, flight, freeze. It's designed to keep us safe by reacting very quickly to anything that feels threatening. This alarm is driven by a small but powerful part of the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is constantly scanning our environment for danger, and when it senses threat, it acts fast before we've had time to think, and it sends the body into action. So our heart rate increases, our breathing speeds up, our muscles tense. And in fact, the wiring is so efficient that these changes happen so quickly, even before our brain's visual centers have had a chance to fully process what's happening. So for example, if we were in person right now and I threw something at you, you would jump out of the way before you've had a chance to even process why I was throwing something at you. The challenge is that this system is not just triggered by physical danger, it responds to perceived threat. So for adults, that might be work pressure, conflict, feeling overwhelmed. And for kids, it could be things like feeling embarrassed, hearing no, losing a game, or feeling misunderstood. To a child's nervous system, these moments can feel just as intense as real danger. And when their amygdala is in charge, their thinking brain goes offline. And that's when we see meltdowns, aggression, withdrawal, or shutdown. So if we go back to my handy model of the brain, when we're calm, the rational thinking part of our brain, or what I like to call the upstairs part of our brain, is connected to the more survival automatic downstairs part of our brain. However, when the stress response system is activated, which is in our thumb, the limbic system, the lower parts of the brain run the show and the upstairs brain is taken offline. How quickly that comes back online is actually dependent on a number of factors, but one really important one is how well developed our upstairs brain is. So I like to explain this using a personal example. So I had to go get a mole removed on my leg. It was perfectly fine, but I had to get it removed. And I didn't do a ton of research. And in my head, I don't know why, I thought the way to remove a mole was like with freezing it off. So I was calm and I'm okay, this is going to get removed. So I went to go get it done. And the first thing happens is the nurse takes out a needle. Well, I don't really like needles. So all of a sudden, my alarm is starting to go off. And then all of a sudden, she whips out a scalpel and she goes to cut the mole off. And my upstairs brain fully comes offline and I start screaming, ow, ow, ow. So she pulls her hand away and she said, can you feel that? Because she had just frozen it. And I said, no. And then I started laughing hysterically. And I share this embarrassing story to show how, even though I think I have a relatively well-developed upstairs brain, in that moment, my alarm went off, my upstairs brain went online, and my downstairs brain took over, and my fight, flight, freeze response, or in my case, scream response, took over. And so think about it for kids whose brains aren't fully developed. When their upstairs brain goes offline, they need a lot of support to get their brain back online. So for kids, when they're upset, anxious, or angry, the feeling part of their brain takes over. And in this state, logic, reasoning, problem solving aren't available. So we might see our child yell, cry, run away, or even freeze up. And those are the fight, flight, or freeze responses in action. Our child isn't trying to give us a hard time. Their upstairs brain is actually offline. And because their brain isn't fully developed yet, it's much harder for them to bring their upstairs brain back online. In fact, they need us adults with our fully developed brains to help their brain reconnect. And so that's what we mean by co-regulation. It's calming with your child so their brain can come back online, and then they learn to self-regulate on their own in the future. So before we get into how to co-regulate, I want to talk a little bit about what we mean when I talk about emotion regulation and how we actually learn to regulate our emotions. So emotion regulation is a skill that involves noticing you're having an emotion, so the physiological response, knowing what that emotion is, expressing it in a clear and healthy way, and managing the emotion so we could start to feel calm. Babies and children don't come into the world with an app for emotion regulation. They cannot regulate their emotional arousal on their own. They need the soothing presence of caretakers to help them manage fear, frustration, and anger, so essentially to co-regulate for them. And over time, through that co-regulation, they learn how to regulate their own emotions. So the way I like to explain it is using thermometers. So as the healthy functioning adults that we are, we all have little thermometers inside of us. And I have one for anger, one for sadness, one for fear. And without even having to be conscious of it, I am always paying attention to what my temperature is. And I know different strategies to bring down my thermometer depending on what I'm feeling. Kids and babies don't have separate thermometers. They have one thermometer for arousal level and anything that happens. So they get tired, their arousal goes up. They get hungry, their arousal goes up. They get excited, the arousal goes up. And so as their arousal goes up, you might see some dysregulated behaviors because they don't know how to bring their temperature down. How they learn it is through our responses. And when you think about it, naturally, how we respond to babies is to pay attention to what's going on with their thermometers and help them bring it down. So when a baby is sad, we soothe them and we rub their back when they're fussy and we talk to them in very calm voices. When they're hungry, we acknowledge the hunger and we meet the need by giving them the food. When a baby's scared, we talk, when they get startled easily, we might pick them up and say, oh, you're so scared, and we soothe them. And over time, repeated co-regulation teaches the child how to self-soothe. So it's through our repeated responses to babies that they start to learn about these different thermometers and what needs to get met to bring the temperature down. Kids also learn through that co-regulation that my feelings are okay, my feelings are manageable, my feelings won't kill me, my feelings don't push others away. But when caregivers are reactive or avoidant or aren't able to help a child co-regulate, children often stay stuck in that heightened arousal or they shut down. So co-regulation isn't about fixing feelings, it's about providing a steady thermostat that supports the child's internal system of thermometers. Co-regulation is essential for all children, but how much they need and for how long is really unique to each child. Even with the same calm, responsive caregiving, some children struggle more than others, and that's where temperament comes in. One of the biggest aha moments for many caregivers is realizing that kids come into the world wired differently. Temperament is that built-in wiring, the early blueprint for how a child experiences and reacts to the world around them. So the image I have on the screen shows the classic research on temperament. It's 9 traits that describe how children naturally respond to the world. So things like their activity level, their sensitivity, how intense their emotions are, how easily they adapt to change. And every child has all of these traits, but in different amounts. It's like each child has their own unique recipe or unique combination of traits. So some kids have naturally calm nervous systems. They can recover quickly from frustration or disappointment. Others are born with more sensitive reactive systems. They feel things deeply, startle easily, and take longer to settle. None of these combinations are better or worse. They're just different designs that need different kinds of support from us as caregivers. So if we think back to the brain slide that I showed you, that amygdala, our alarm system, some kids have a more sensitive alarm that goes off more quickly and more loudly. Others have a quieter one that takes a lot to trigger. So the child with the sensitive alarm might seem dramatic, but really their nervous system is just doing its job. It's just more finely tuned, and these kids might need more help with calming. So as caregivers, our role isn't to change their temperament, it's to understand it. And when we realize that each child comes wired differently, we can start to see that a child's chronological age doesn't always match their emotional age. And we also realize what works for one child might not work for another. So kids with more sensitive wiring might need us to co-regulate with them more often and to an older age than a child with a less sensitive alarm. And when we adjust our expectations and strategies to fit the child in front of us, we create emotional safety. And when we stop fighting the wiring and start working with it, co-regulation becomes a lot easier, and our relationship feels more like a partnership than a battle. So when we understand that our child's temperament underlies a lot of their behavior, it can really help us respond rather than react. Understanding temperament and what's going on in our children's brains when they're having a big emotional reaction really invites us to shift our focus from what's wrong with my child to how are we responding when their nervous system is overwhelmed. Before I move on, I want to discuss the typical ways that caregivers tend to respond when kids have big emotions and behaviors. We often respond in logical ways that make sense. We want to stop pain, we want order, we want to be efficient, and we want to teach our kids to be regulated humans. The problem is that many of the typical child management strategies that many of us use, things like rewards, consequences, timeouts, punishments, those are all upstairs brain strategies. They rely on the thinking part of the brain to be able to reflect on choices and behaviors, choose the appropriate response. These strategies may work for kids who already have the ability to regulate their emotions and behaviors and just need a bit of a reminder, but they don't work on kids whose brains are wired more reactively, because in the moment, these kids can't access their upstairs brain to make good choices. So instead, they need us to help them bring their upstairs brain back online. So we need to look at their dysregulation as a lack of skill versus a lack of will. Meaning, if they could do better, they would do better. So the example I'd like to use to explain this comes from Ross Greene, who developed collaborative problem solving, which you might have heard about, which is an approach to working with kids and teens who might have challenging behaviors. So if we look at emotion dysregulation and challenging behaviors as a skill deficit in a kid's ability to regulate their emotions and behavior, then we need to look at it like any other skill. So, for example, if I can't swim because I have not developed that skill and I'm in the water drowning, would it help if we used rewards? So, if you said, I'll give you $5 if you swim to the edge. No. What about if we use consequences? So, if you don't swim to the edge, you'll be fired. Would either rewards or consequences help if I don't know how to swim? What do I actually need in the moment? I need a life preserver or someone to come and rescue me. So the same is true for kids who don't have the ability to regulate their big emotions and behaviors. They need support from adults around them. We need to throw them a life preserver and help them get to safety. And once they're safe and calm, we can teach them how to swim. So if we go back to my hand model, we need to respond to the downstairs brain, much like we would with a baby, by soothing it, by helping the baby learn to regulate and bring the upstairs brain back online so that we could then teach our children to make good choices and to learn how to calm on their own. So the skills we'll cover in the remainder of this presentation are really designed to replace those reactive patterns with something that calms and teaches. So based on everything I said so far, I want to ground us in one really important reminder. Kids' emotional meltdowns or tantrums are not misbehavior, they're dysregulation. So a tantrum doesn't mean your child is being manipulative, dramatic, or trying to make your life difficult. It means their nervous system has hit overwhelm and their upstairs brain has gone offline. What tantrums do tell us is that a child's having a hard time, not giving us a hard time. They're showing us they need support, skill building, and co-regulation, not punishment or shame. And this can help center us so we can move into some downstairs brain strategies. Before we get into the first step of co-regulation, I really want to highlight something very important. Caring for others, especially children who don't have fully developed brains, can be so rewarding. But it could also be one of the most stressful, difficult, and anxiety-inducing experiences too. Stress is a normal and actually necessary part of being a caregiver. I like to describe caregiving really as a job of emotional labor. Specifically, our brains are hardwired to feel distress when we hear a baby or child cry. So a baby's cry signals our alarm and triggers an immediate response and feelings of urgency and anxiety. It happens to all adults, not just parents or caregivers. And this is likely because it helped our species survive and ensures that infants get care, whether it needs food, comfort, or to be kept safe. So when a child has a big meltdown, our downstairs brain takes over and our upstairs thinking brain is slower or comes offline. We might feel distressed, anxious, or even angry, especially when we're not able to easily soothe or stop it. And that's completely normal and expected reaction. When we have kids who are more emotionally reactive or who have difficulty regulating their emotions or behaviors, over time, this constant activation of our stress response system can deplete us and make it more difficult to bring our upstairs brain back online quickly. I mention this because we're now going to get into how to co-regulate. And the very first step is to ensure that we are calm, regulated, and grounded ourselves. So how do we do this? So we need to empty our basket. So let me explain. I like to explain using a basket analogy that I once heard. So specifically, all children have very small emotional baskets. Stresses and emotional arousal go into their basket, and because they have very limited strategies to empty their basket can easily overflow. And it's really the job of the adult in the child's life to catch the overflow, because this helps kids learn to regulate their big feelings. So when an adult can catch the emotions and help kids empty their baskets, children eventually learn how to do that for themselves. However, catching the overflow from other people's baskets, especially kids, can be really hard because sometimes instead of a basket, they have more of like a thimble with many little holes in it, and the feelings just ooze out everywhere. And this can be stressful for any of the adults caring for these kids. So it's important for us as adults to also ensure that we're emptying our baskets, because even though our baskets are bigger than our child's, our baskets can also get full and overflow. And when that happens, it makes it almost impossible to catch our kids' overflow and to provide the support they need. So we need to constantly attend to our basket and ensure we're emptying it in healthy and adaptive ways. So, for example, we could avoid personalizing our child's behaviors and remember that they're struggling with their downstairs brain. We could be prepared and anticipate challenges and reactions ahead of time so that we can adopt the mindset that this is the child's downstairs brain and we can plan ahead for how to handle a situation. We also need to have our own solid support system that provides reciprocity, acceptance, and understanding so that we're getting this need met in areas of our life. And we need to ensure that we have our own adequate social supports who can help catch the overflow. So, for example, supportive family or friends, or a professional, or a support group. And we need to engage in self-care activities. And I actually did a separate presentation on self-care for parents of children's mental health. So I would encourage you to look at that recording as well if you're looking for some strategies to empty your basket. And finally, we need to practice our own emotion regulation strategies. And I really want to emphasize this is not a luxury. Taking care of ourselves and making sure that we're well regulated and that our stress is managed is essential to support our kids because it enables us to be able to co-regulate them. So like they say on an airplane, we need to put on our oxygen mask first before we could put on theirs. So now let's get into how we could respond to and co-regulate our child's emotions. So when we talk about co-regulation, we're talking about the process of calming with your child. It's not about fixing behavior or explaining feelings right away. It's about creating a sense of safety through your presence. A child's nervous system is constantly reading ours for cues. Are we safe? Are we calm? Can I relax? So when we slow our breathing, soften our face, and use a gentle tone, our child's brain begins to mirror that calm. So think of co-regulation as saying to your child, your feelings are big and your basket is overflowing, but my calm can hold them. So before we could teach skills or talk about what happened, we have to help their body feel safe enough to listen, which means we have to get their upstairs brain back online. So when a child's overwhelmed, yelling, crying, or shutting down, their upstairs brain has come offline, their logical thinking brain, and the emotional alarm system is running the show. So in that moment, your child can't reason, problem solve, or take in lessons. So what helps isn't more words, it's that nervous system connection. So co-regulation means using your calm body, your steady tone, your presence to signal you are safe, I can handle your feelings. So it's calming with them, not calming them down. So when our body stays steady, our child's nervous system starts to synchronize with ours. So that's the biology of safety in action. So let's talk about something that every caregiver deals with. What do we do with our bodies when our child is in the middle of an emotional storm? Because even when we understand co-regulation in theory, in real life, it's incredibly hard. When our child is yelling, crying, or spiraling into panic, that intense emotional energy hits our nervous system too. Our own alarm, our amygdala starts to get activated. Our heart speeds up, our muscles tense, and just like our kids, our upstairs brain goes offline. So in those moments, our job isn't to fix the behavior, it's to turn off our alarm first. And there's a few simple, reliable ways to do that. The first is deep breathing. When our alarm gets triggered, our breathing becomes rapid and shallow. That's the downstairs brain preparing our body for fight or flight. Deep, slow breathing does the opposite. It signals our parasympathetic nervous system, so our rest and settle system, to come back online. So a simple breathing pattern you can try in the moment is to inhale for a count of 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold it for 1, 2, 3, 4, and then exhale for a count of 6. The longer exhale tells your brain, I'm safe, I don't need to react, I can come back into control. So deep breathing like this increases oxygen to your thinking brain. So the very part of your brain that shuts down during stress. And so it helps your upstairs brain come back online. The next thing we can do to help us stay focused and ready to co-regulate is to ground ourselves in the present. When we're overwhelmed, our mind jumps to the future or the past. What if this gets worse? Why is this happening again? Grounding pulls us back into the present moment, which can help quiet our amygdala. So try something simple like feeling your feet on the floor, relaxing your shoulders, or you could even focus your senses and notice 5 things you see in the room. These tiny shifts anchor your body so your child can then anchor to you. If these strategies aren't working, a third thing you can try is to take a brief break, as long as it's safe to do so. Sometimes the most regulated thing we can do in the moment is to step away for a few seconds so that we can calm our alarm outside of the storm. Saying something like, "I'm here, I just need 30 seconds to breathe so I can help you better," can go a very long way. A short pause gives your nervous system space to reset so you can come back with clarity instead of reactivity. Another thing you can try in the moment to help keep you calm is to engage in some small movements. So stress hormones build up in the body and movement actually helps release them. Even small movements, so things like stretching your hands, rolling your shoulders, or even taking a few steps can help settle the physiological storm inside you. Just a little motion can help shift your state enough to re-engage calmly. And finally, being aware of and labeling your own emotion can actually help reduce the intensity. Recognizing and naming, "I'm getting overwhelmed, I'm feeling frustrated," is important because when we're labeling our emotions, we're actually activating our prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking part of the brain. And it helps us catch our child's feelings in our basket without getting swept into the overflow. So the main point here to remember is that co-regulation starts with us. When we can bring our own nervous system back into balance, even a little, we become the steady, grounded presence our child needs to find their way back to calm. Okay, so once we've slowed our own body and the immediate alarm has quieted a little and our upstairs brain is back online, we're ready to help our child's upstairs brain get back online. And this is really important. If we're in a heightened downstairs brain state, our child's nervous system will sense danger and will not be able to help them regulate. Only when our alarm has turned off can we help turn off our child's. So to begin, depending on how escalated the child is, you might need to do a quick physiological regulation step first. So for example, getting them to breathe with you once or twice. When their breathing settles and they're a little more present, we move into something called emotion coaching. So emotion coaching is the process of teaching kids how emotion works, especially in the moments when those emotions feel the biggest. It's not about stopping feelings or fixing them. It's about helping kids understand what they are experiencing and then giving them the skills to handle those feelings in healthy ways. So giving kids permission to feel their feelings is essential. And I could go on a whole rant about this, but much of our culture is emotion averse. We often tell kids, "Don't cry, don't be sad, don't be mad." And many concerning behaviors, like things like self-harm, substance use, and so on, are really unhealthy strategies that people use to try to avoid feeling their emotions. Instead, we want to teach kids to identify and tolerate their emotions and to learn strategies to help soothe them in adaptive ways. So we need to teach them how to empty their basket in healthy ways. So emotion coaching values all feelings. Every feeling's valid and makes sense from a child's point of view, but it also teaches that not all behaviors are okay. So becoming an emotion coach takes time, repetition, and patience, but research is very clear. This approach helps kids learn to calm their bodies, manage frustration, build resilience, and strengthen their relationship with you. In other words, it's one of the most powerful tools we can give our kids for emotional health. So it's a simple, practical way to help your child feel understood, calm down, and learn how to handle big feelings. It's not a lecture or a tidy script. It's an attitude: calm, curious, and connected. So there's 4 steps to emotion coaching. The first is to acknowledge or notice that your child's upset. So first you notice and name what you see. This is usually a one-line observation that tells your child they've been seen. So for example, "You look really upset right now. I can hear how frustrated you are." This small move helps them feel recognized before you try to coach anything. The first moment of recognition tells your child you're not alone, and that sense of connection helps settle their nervous system so they could actually take in your support. When a child feels noticed rather than corrected, the emotional intensity drops. The second step is to label the feeling. So help them put a word to the feeling: angry, sad, disappointed, scared. You might be familiar with the expression, "we have to name it to tame it." Naming the feeling helps the brain make sense of the physical overwhelm. So, for example, you seem really angry, you sound really disappointed. If you're not sure what they're feeling, look for physical and verbal cues and use curious, gentle language. So, something like, I wonder if you might be feeling nervous about this, or I wonder if you might be feeling sad right now. This approach is especially helpful with older kids and teens whose emotions can be harder to read. Their feelings may show up in less obvious ways, so offering a guess helps them feel understood without pressuring them to explain before they're ready. And then the third step is to validate the emotion. When adults understand a child's internal state and reflect their emotions back to them in consistent and empathic ways, this helps the child to become more aware of, label, and understand their own mental states, and then teaches them how to regulate their own emotional states. So validation is really the heart of emotion coaching. It says, I see you, I get you, your feelings make sense. It's how we calm the alarm and open the door to learning. So how we validate is to put ourselves in our child's shoes and see a situation from their perspective, and then demonstrate we understand where they're coming from. And we use the word because. The recommended number of becauses is 3, because this really helps the child feel understood and also gives a chance for their nervous system to calm and take in the validation. So for example, it might look something like this. It makes sense that you're feeling really mad because you really wanted that toy, and because it's really hard when we want something we can't have, and because I said no and you don't agree with it. Each because you give promotes more brain flexibility and calms their alarm. When we validate with the word because, we're helping a child regulate because they're not having to think of the words themselves when they're in this overwhelmed state, and they're also not having to think of ways to convince or debate you. So when there is a match between the child's internal state and their external environment, their brain's alarm can calm down. So the example I like to use that I'm sure we can all relate to is respect to anger over limit setting. So for example, if I'm angry because I want something and you said no, if you come at me with anger or telling me to get over it, my alarm goes off because my need is not met. I feel threat. And then I'm going to spend all of my energy trying to convince you of why you need to meet that need. Because of course, if only you understood, you would agree with me. So I'm not going to hear anything you're saying to me because I'm in defensive mode. My downstairs brain, the fight or flight, has taken over, and I am trying to get my need met. But when you preemptively put words to my internal experience by verbalizing what's going on for me, my alarm no longer signals threat and my brain calms and I'm able to have a more productive discussion. So if we go back to the thermometers I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, when we validate a child's experience, we're helping build those tiny connections in the brain and to start to separate those little thermometers for different emotions, much like we do with a baby when we're reflecting their experience. So through validation, we're assisting them in organizing and understanding their experience and communicating that we're there to help and support them. So when validating, one thing to be aware of is our language. We're often tempted to say, I understand you're feeling XYZ. For some kids, that's fine. But for other kids, especially older kids and teens, the word understand can be tricky because oftentimes teens feel like no one can understand. So instead of saying, I can understand, you can also say, I wonder if you might be feeling, or I can imagine you might feel. I also want to highlight that validating a feeling is not the same as validating a behavior. If a child is physically or verbally aggressive, that behavior is not okay, and we wouldn't say it's okay. What we're validating is their feeling, even if their emotion is coming from a misinterpretation. Their feeling makes sense given their perspective. That's the message we want to convey. I also want to say often validation needs to be repeated. Some kids won't be able to regulate the very first time you coach them. Keep validating calmly as needed. Repetition is an important part of co-regulation, and we want to stay with this step as long as needed to let their alarm calm and their upstairs brain come back online. We cannot proceed to the fourth step if they're still in a heightened downstairs brain state because they won't be able to benefit from it. So once we validated the emotion and we see that the child's alarm has settled, their breathing slows, their body softens a bit, maybe their tone shift, that's a sign their upstairs brain is coming back online. And only then do we move into step 4, which is meeting the need. This is where we support the child in a way that matches the emotion underneath the behavior. So every emotion has a need. So for example, sadness needs comfort, fear needs safety, anger needs boundaries. And as kids are learning to regulate their emotions, they might need a little bit of help figuring out what to do next. So if your child is sad, you might offer closeness or comfort, sitting beside them, giving them a hug if they want one, or saying something like, "I'm right here. Do you want to sit with me while we calm down together?" If your child's afraid, you might offer reassurance and safety. You might say, "I'm going to stay with you. You're safe. Let's take this one step at a time." Or you might problem solve together. "Would it help if I walked into the party with you and stayed until you found a friend?" If your child's angry, anger often needs patience and a boundary. So I'm going to discuss setting a boundary in one moment, but for now, it might sound something like, "It's okay to feel angry. Let's figure out what you can do with your anger." Then you could suggest options like squeezing a stress ball, taking space, or using words. The idea with this 4th step is once the emotion has passed and they're regulated, you can gently guide them towards problem solving or the next step. So something like, "I wonder if it might help to take our mind off the treat by going outside and playing with the ball," or "What's one small thing we could try to make this easier?" The idea is we don't jump to solutions until the child's calm enough to use their thinking brain again. We meet them where they're at emotionally and we help them take a step forward. That's how kids learn not only what they feel, but what to do with their feelings. And the final thing I want to say about emotion coaching is that this approach works. And for kids who might have more sensitive alarms, their brain's not going to learn how to regulate independently after 1 or 2 times of emotion coaching. This isn't a quick solution. In fact, you might need to repeat the validation step several times before a child's calm enough to get the practical support. But over time and with enough repetition, we're helping to build new connections in their brains and help them learn how to regulate their big feelings. At this point in the presentation, you might be thinking emotion coaching and validation is great, but what do I do if my kid's big emotion is also expressed with big behaviors that aren't okay? So when that happens, first we validate the feeling and not the behavior and go through the emotion coaching steps to get their upstairs brain back online. And then once our child is calmer, we address the behavior. Kids need boundaries just as much as they need empathy. However, one of the biggest mistakes parents make when trying to set boundaries is by using the word "but." When we say something like, "I know you're upset, but we don't hit," the child's nervous system often hears, "Your feelings don't matter." The word "but" cancels everything that came before it. Instead, one of the most effective ways to set boundaries is by using the word "and" instead of "but." When we replace "but" with "and," we send a very different message, one that communicates your feelings are real and there are still boundaries around your behavior. So it might sound like, "I can see you're angry because I said no and we don't hit. Let's figure out what you can do when you're mad." With "and," we're holding 2 truths at once. It's absolutely okay to feel what you feel, and it's not okay to hurt others or break the limit. So this approach helps keep your child's emotional brain open instead of shutting down. It keeps the connection intact while you set the limit, and it teaches that feelings are allowed, but not all behaviors are allowed. From there, we could gently redirect the child towards a healthier action. So using words, taking space, squeezing a pillow, asking for help, whatever matches the need in the moment. So in the words by Dr. Dan Siegel, we say connect before you correct or redirect. Okay, I'm going to wrap up. But before wrapping up, because emotion coaching is the key skill to help teach your child how to regulate their emotions in adaptive and healthy ways, I want to summarize the key points. Remember, we need to make sure our upstairs brain is online before we could help our kids bring theirs back online. When co-regulating with our kids, we want to convey the message that all emotions are okay. Emotions are natural and normal. We validate the emotion, not the behavior. We want to empathize with our child from their point of view. This doesn't mean agreeing with them, it means viewing things from their perspective. When correcting behavior, use the word and instead of but. So I understand you're angry and it's not okay to scream. So what can we do instead? And only proceed to provide support or meet their need and problem solve when our child's calm enough for words. So support can include things like comfort, reassurance, togetherness, or practical support like problem solving or doing things with your child or teaching. And on this next slide, I have several ideas here for ways to offer support. So things like distraction, releasing energy, attending to basic needs, and so on. On these next two slides are also some helpful resources. So there's phrases you could use, there's scripts that can help you get started. I've also directed you to an incredible website that has all things emotion coaching, mentalhealthfoundations.ca, so you can check that out here. And as we wrap up today, I want to leave you with one central message. You don't have to be a perfect parent to raise an emotionally healthy child. You just have to be a regulating one. Co-regulation and emotion coaching aren't about having the right words every time or even about staying calm in every moment. They're about practicing presence. So noticing, slowing down, offering connection before correction, and remembering that every tough moment is an opportunity to teach your child something powerful about emotions, safety, and relationships. So the more you model calm, name feelings, set boundaries with empathy, and reconnect with your child after the storm, the more your child's brain learns, I can handle big feelings, I'm not alone, I can come back to calm. And these skills take time and they take repetition. So some days will go better than others for you and your child, and that's okay. You're building something long-term, which is emotional resilience, trust, and a felt sense of safety that your child will carry forward for the rest of their lives. Thank you.